let's continue where we left off, shall we? Here we are in the midst of a pandemic caused by a virus that was never isolated and thus never proven to exist. But for some reason, politics is almighty powerful compared to science, and so insanity struck to the point where the world would never be the same again. It started with social distancing and face masks. Every news channel, every newspaper, every talk show, all they could write, talk and scream hysterically about was COVID-19. Road signs appeared, reiterating the importance of social distancing. By keeping a distance of at least 6 feet or 1.5 meters, one would be safe. If you ignored, you could die. Or worse, you could kill somebody else. Hugging belonged to the past. Any form of physical closeness was potentially extremely dangerous. Repetition, repetition, repetition. 24/7. Combined with horror stories from Italy, we, the people, got scared. The first wave, not of a virus but of fear, hit the shores of just about every country in the world. And when fear takes over, rational thinking becomes difficult, if not impossible. Nobody told us that the Italians who died during that first so-called outbreak were of very old age. They had all been vaccinated early 2019 with an experimental flu shot, a cocktail of 4 different types of influenza, among which H1N1, the swine flu. When they were hit with the autumn flu, their immune system was down. They didn't stand a chance. Then, the first official numbers were published. Mostly old people were dying of this monster virus. Children were perfectly safe, and adults were as good as safe. The elderly had a 5.5% chance of dying. Those who pointed out that a survival rate of 94.5% was pretty darn good for people who had already outlived the average life expectancy were scorned for being selfish, extremely irresponsible, and racist. How dare they? The epidemiology modelling team at Imperial College London, led by the physicist Neil Ferguson, presented their official predictions. If nothing was done to stop this virus, 81% of the US population would be infected, of which 2.2 million would die. The UK would count 510,000 deaths. My! Those predictions were absolutely horrifying. God only knows why Neil Ferguson and Imperial College London were asked for their opinion in the first place. They had a history of highly exaggerated numbers that were always way off. According to the American Institute for Economic Research, although Ferguson's team has a bad habit of falsely claiming credit for saving millions of lives premised upon these apocalyptic numbers, the truth is they all amounted to wild exaggerations from a fundamentally flawed model. Why on earth did UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson listen to this disgrace of a scientist? Would you believe a man who predicted the following in the past? 2002, Ferguson predicted 150,000 people would probably die in the UK as a result of BSE in beef. Really? Well, no. In reality, only 177 people died. 2005, Ferguson predicted 150 million people would probably die as a result of the bird flu. In reality, only 282 people died worldwide. 2009, Ferguson predicted 65,000 people would probably die in the UK as a result of the swine flu. In reality, only 457 people died. Would you choose this man, of all scientists out there, to advise your government on how to handle COVID-19 in your country? When Ferguson was confronted with his fundamentally flawed model and his huge mistakes, he tried to blame the model, stating it was 13 years old and not really made for COVID-19, but for a flu epidemic in general. Then, when he was asked to share his model with the scientific world, he refused. Why? Because he knew perfectly well it was complete and utter bullshit. It took him 6 months to rewrite the model and present something that still didn't make any sense. When Ferguson was asked why the real UK numbers were so much lower than his predictions, his prompt answer was that this was because of his excellent recommendations. When confronted with a situation in Sweden that refused to lock down or implement any other severe COVID restrictions, yet had quite low COVID casualties, his answer was that, no doubt, the numbers could have been much lower if they had implemented his brilliant recommendations. On top of everything else, he ignored his own advice and thus the COVID restrictions by inviting his secret lover into his home. When this became common knowledge, he resigned from his position as a government advisor on SAGE, the Scientific Advisory Group for Emergencies. Wow, how noble and just. If it weren't for the fact that that too was just another lie. Until today, Ferguson is part of both SAGE and Advisory Committee SPY-M. He also is acting director of the Vaccine Impact Modelling Consortium based at Imperial College London and financed by Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation that actually owns Gavi and that granted Imperial College London millions of dollars. Long story short, once again we are witnessing utterly corrupted politics and bribed science, working together to impose something on the people that the people hadn't asked for to begin with. Professor Lockdown and Boris Johnson rolled out a strategy to take the freedoms away from the British people under the pretense of protecting them against a killer virus that didn't exist. But that they kept to themselves. And so, in 2020, government policies were quickly adapted to Ferguson's hysteric and completely unrealistic warnings. New restrictions were laid out. We were no longer to visit our elderly parents and grandparents. No hugging, definitely no hugging, and preferably no visits in general. Children were told in school that they might kill their grandparents if they disobeyed. This insane and inhumane programming led to deep emotional and psychological trauma. Feelings of guilt overtook these children, who were told they were basically murderers in waiting, unless, of course, they did as they were told by the government, completely overruling and ignoring their own feelings. When they screamed for their grandparents, they were told off about how selfish they were. Shame was added to their feelings of guilt. Some people stood in front of the care homes and sang songs for the abandoned elderly, but the police removed them. They were attracting attention to the site and the situation, and that was not desirable. The elderly were isolated from the rest of society and from their families. Many became depressed and lost their will to live. Many died as a result, not from COVID, but from loneliness. Families were torn apart. Feelings of guilt, shame, anger and grief became common ground. Yet, the people complied. There was another reason why so many elderly died during the first wave in the spring of 2020. And this is where it gets really shocking. In March 2020, the British people were told to stay at home in order to protect the NHS and to save lives. The authorities just needed 3 weeks to flatten the curve. What happened in those 3 weeks? First of all, many hospitals were ordered to move elderly patients with respiratory problems to care homes. As many as possible, which is rather strange when you think about it. I mean, people are not administered to a hospital for fun, right? But it happened. On March 19, a directive was sent out to the NHS saying all patients who did not require a hospital bed had to be discharged, as in right now. The NHS workers were obliged to follow the new directive. They had precisely 1 hour to get those patients out of bed and into their clothes, after which they had another 2 hours to take them from the hospital to their new home, in most cases a care home. Did those patients have a voice in this at all? No, they did not. Their beds had to be empty for COVID-19 patients, those poor sufferers of a virus that had not been proven and would never be proven to exist. This directive was most efficient, as you can see in this graph. Only 62% occupancy of hospital beds remained, 30% down compared to previous years. So, what happened to those patients who ended up in care homes? They were euthanized. Do we have evidence for such a brutal claim? Yes, we do. But we must warn you, for this is truly as ugly as it possibly gets. You might even realize for the first time what happened to your parents or grandparents and why they suddenly died. You see, all of a sudden, in April 2020, there was a great increase in deaths in care homes. No less than 26,541 people died in April 2020 alone, an increase of 17,850 on the 5-year average. That's an awful lot of excess deaths in just 1 month. What happened? They were given midazolam. That's what happened. But you weren't told, were you? And neither were they. Midazolam is a very strong sedative, used, among other things, to relieve anxiety and fear. It is also used in lethal injections in the US, combined with 2 other drugs. The NHS workers were told to ease the suffering of the patients who were removed from their hospital beds and were now in their care home beds. Most of them had respiratory problems, so wouldn't it be nice to give them an intravenous cocktail of morphine and midazolam? Sounds sweet, doesn't it? Well, it wasn't. You see, midazolam affects the central nervous system, and thus a person's breathing. Midazolam is the last drug on earth these patients should have been given. It causes shallow, slowed or temporarily stopped breathing that may lead to permanent brain injury or death. Furthermore, midazolam is dangerous for elderly patients in general, also for those who don't even have breathing problems. If given at all, it should be done at a very low dosage. This is what would have been safe, according to a policy that was in place before the COVID-19 outbreak scam. A dosage for the elderly should not be greater than 0.5 milligram, max 1 milligram. However, during the outbreak, this policy was changed into the following: a starting dose of 2.5 milligrams and, if necessary, pump it up to 5 or even 10 milligrams. Who on earth changed these policies? The same people who had those thousands of patients removed from hospitals to care homes. The same who advised administering midazolam in the first place. The same who knew damn well what the effects would be. The very same who ordered insane amounts of midazolam at the beginning of 2020. So much so, it had to be imported from France. That's right, a 2-year supply of a killer drug was imported from France. It was all used up by October of that same year. Not as part of the anesthesia during surgery, as was the official explanation. There were no surgeries during these COVID months. They were postponed by the same criminals, guilty of genocide of 26,500 people who died in April 2020 alone in care homes. Those people choked to death. Midazolam side effect, significant depression of respiration, killed them. They suffocated. What was written on their death certificates? Cause of death, COVID-19. Who are the criminals behind this evil scheme? Secretary of State for Health and Social Care, Matt Hancock. GP and Member of Parliament, Dr. Luke Evans. And the Department of Health. Here they are, deliberating their midazolam stockpile to make sure they were ready for the kill.
A good death needs 3 things. It needs equipment, it needs medication, and it needs the staff to administer it. So in terms of equipment, a few quick questions. Do you have enough syringe drivers in the NHS to deliver medications to keep people comfortable when they're passing away?
Yes, right now we do.
And the second one is with that's to the syringe drivers deliver medication, particularly things like midazolam and morphine. Do you have any precautions put in place to make sure we have enough of those medications to be delivered?
Yes, we've got a big project to make sure that those sorts of medications, as well as the ITU medications that I spoke about earlier, that the supply chains, the global supply chains for those medicines are clear.
The so-called good death Hancock and Evans talked about means euthanasia. What you just witnessed was part of a parliamentary committee meeting in which euthanizing the elderly in care homes by means of midazolam and morphine was openly dealt with. Did they act on their own accord? Of course not. The Department of Health, Prime Minister Boris Johnson, each and every puppet of the cabal presently seated in the British government were part of this grand euthanasia scheme of the elderly, as part of the global sustainable development goals and thus the depopulation agenda. Shocking to see it in action, isn't it? Yet another must they pushed down the throats of the NHS workers was to add a do not resuscitate notice on the files of the care home residents. If their hearts or lungs stopped working, that was it. No resuscitation, please, as that did not exactly fit the depopulation agenda. Just let them die, the useless eaters. Oh, and of course, nobody told the residents or their loved ones a thing. The 3 weeks the authorities needed to flatten the curve was invented to intentionally end the lives of 26,500 people. That's why the British people had to stay home. Not to protect the NHS or to save lives, but to let the cabal execute their evil euthanasia program. This didn't just happen in the UK. It happened in Australia, the US, and in many other countries. When Wayne Smith unravelled the midazolam scandal after his father died in his care home, he exposed what he had found. He was subsequently found dead in his home in August 21. Rest in peace, Wayne Smith, and all Midazolam victims. You will be remembered. Back to our storyline of fake pandemics and corrupt politicians. Face masks were introduced, an insane measure, as any virologist could have told you. You see, a virus is so eeny-weeny tiny, it goes straight through the fabric of any type of face mask. It's like trying to keep the mosquitoes out by putting up a wire netting fence. The cabal was laughing in our face. The CDC, NIH, the WHO, the Dutch RIVM, they all admitted on camera that face masks are not effective against viruses.
Right now in the United States, people should not be walking around with masks.
You're sure of it? Because people are listening really closely to this.
Right now, people should not be walking. There's no reason to be walking around with a mask. When you're in the middle of an outbreak, wearing a mask might make people feel a little bit better, and it might even block a droplet, but it's not providing the perfect protection that people think that it is.
Fauci later changed his opinion, now recommending people to wear 2 or even 3 masks on top of each other. When he was confronted with his earlier statements about face masks being useless, he stated that he had lied. Why? Because he was afraid there would be a shortage of surgical masks if everybody would stop buying them. In order to keep the doctors safe, he had lied to the people, which means that if he did believe the masks worked, he just didn't care that people died, as long as the doctors kept living? Interesting statement. But as it turned out, Fauci wasn't lying. At least, not that time.
Should you wear a mask if you're healthy?
No.
That's right. You really said it.
Should you wear a mask if you're healthy?
No.
Het instituut toont dat ongeveer 200.000 personen tenminste een week een mondkapje moeten dragen om misschien, en dan zeg ik nog misschien erbij, één geval van besmetting te voorkomen, van overdracht te voorkomen. Dus een buitengewoon klein effect weten we momenteel.
Omdat er vanuit medisch oogpunt geen bewezen effectiviteit is van mondkapjes, heeft het kabinet besloten dat er geen landelijke verplichting komt voor het dragen van niet-medische mondkapjes. Vanuit het Veiligheidsberaad kwam wel breed het verzoek om lokaal maatwerk gericht op gedragsbeïnvloeding, dus niet zozeer medisch gerelateerd, maar wel gericht op gedragsbeïnvloeding, om dat instrumentarium toch eens stevig onder de loep te nemen. En ook te kijken waar zou je mee kunnen experimenteren. Waaronder dus ook bijvoorbeeld met mondkapjes. Maar dan gaat het vooral over nieuwe methoden, gericht op gedragsbeïnvloeding en ook te bemeten op het effect.
There was no pandemic. It was all just a behavioral experiment. That's why policies changed, time and again. Not because they made sense. Not because they were backed up by new scientific discoveries, but because they wanted to see how and to what extent they could manipulate people's behavior. what did it take for the people they so despised to change their behavior at the cabal's command? How could they use fear as their ultimate tool to steer the useless eaters by a mere snap of their fingers? Like gods playing with their creation. Like cats playing with mice before finishing them off with one final blow. Do you want to see how quickly and how ugly things escalated? Then follow me to part 20.